Good afternoon, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and it's time for another Victorian poem. So today's poem deals with a theme that possibly hasn't been discussed enough in this year's Victober, despite the fact that it is something that we've been talking about quite a lot over the course of this year, and that is British imperialism and the legacies of empire and opinions of empire within Britain, particularly at towards the end of the Victorian era. This poem is a pro-imperialist poem written by a pro-imperialist person. I wouldn't say it's particularly explicit, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you the little explanation of the background, because without that I don't think you can really get I definitely myself wouldn't have got a clear idea of what this poem's about. And then I will read you the poem. So the poem today is by Alfred Austin, and Alfred Austin was the last poet laureate of the Victorian era. So if you're not from Great Britain or you don't know that much about poetry, since around about the Stuart times, Britain has always had a recognised poet at court that's recognised to be the most important poet, and they're supposed to write poems to commemorate interesting and important events that happen in the nation, like when royal children are born and things like that. The current poet laureate is Simon Armitage. It has now become a post that lasts for about 10 years, I think. But previously it was something that a poet would get it and they would hold on to it until they died, and the status that had. I think thinking about this idea of the poet laureate has really brought home to me just how long the Victorian era was, because there were 4 poet laureates over the course of the Victorian era, and one of them, Tennyson, held the post for 42 years, which is a long time. So the first poet laureate was, I think, Robert Southey. He came into that position while Jane Austen was still alive and writing. Then he died quite near the beginning of the Victorian era, handed over to William Wordsworth, and under that leadership of Wordsworth, the role became a little bit more fluid and a little bit more flexible. It was recognised that he was an older poet that couldn't really be expected to hold all of the particularly rigorous traditions, so it became more a position where people could write what they wanted to write, as opposed to having to write certain poems at certain times. Then when Wordsworth died, the role, as I said, went to Tennyson, and we've already talked about him this week. We read Crossing the Bar. I think that was the second poem, so feel free to go and check that out if you happen to miss that one. And then when Tennyson died, he was so well loved and so admired by the Victorian people in general and lovers of Victorian poetry, that they actually didn't fill the post for several years in kind of recognition and respect of how well loved Tennyson had been. And then eventually, when they came to have to pick somebody else, they picked this guy, Alfred Austin, and apparently his appointment was pretty much met with derision at the time. But the position of the poet laureate, although it is part of it's seen as somebody who's appointed by the king or the queen, at the time being Queen Victoria, the Prime Minister has generally had input into it, and it feels like, just even reading this tiny bit of information, it feels like there was quite a political motivation in terms of who they were choosing at that time, because it was a time when people were starting to question Britain's approach to the world. People were starting to think about ideas of imperialism. They'd already had, as we spoke about in the beginning of this poetry thing with the Hiram Powell's Greek Slave poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, there'd already been a massive anti-slavery movement that had had massive implications for colonies within the British Empire. There had already been sort of changes in the way that colonies were administered and managed, but we were still in really in the throes of imperialism. So I feel like at a point when people were starting to have questions, and the idea of anti-imperialism was beginning to emerge, the choice of a pro-imperialist poet for this very prestigious role that Tennyson had brought so much public approval to, I suppose, was definitely a politically motivated one. And yeah, possibly that was one of the reasons why a lot of other Victorian poets were quite unhappy. George Meredith apparently scathingly observed that it will suit little Alfred to hymn the babies of the House of Hanover. So I just thought you could do with that kind of historical background. Then I'm going to read you the introduction now and then the poem. Okay, so the poem is called Henry Bartle Edward Frere, born AD 1815, died AD 1884. Alfred Austin's angry pro-imperialism is exemplified in this elegy for Sir Bartle Frere, as he was usually known, administrator in India, governor of Bombay, and later governor of the Cape Colony of South Africa. Frere, a prominent opponent of slavery, was charged with implementing the disastrous policy of confederation when he was sent to South Africa, an effort to unite the British colonies and the Afrikaner Boer republics into a single nation under British rule. Frere believed that the destruction of Zulu military forces was a crucial step towards this, and his policy led to the beginning of a war with the Zulus in 1879. The British defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana on the 22nd of January by Zulu forces under Chief Cetewayo, as the Victorians spelt his name, was the first dire result for Frere. The celebrated defence of Rorke's Drift followed. Confederation was abandoned, and although the Battle of Ulundi on 4th of July 1879 saw the British reverse their losses and end the war, Frere's position was unsustainable as far as government back at home was concerned. Fiercely criticised by Parliament, he was recalled to London in July 1880 as Gladstone, an old enemy, returned to the premiership after the general election. The novelist Anthony Trollope, who had visited Frere in South Africa in 1877, wrote of him in 1879, "Frere, for whom I personally have both respect and regard, is a man who thinks it is England's duty to carry English civilization and English Christianity among all the savages. Consequently, having the chance, he has waged war against these unfortunates, who have lived side by side with us in Natal for 25 years without ever raising a hand against us. The consequence is that we have already slaughtered 10,000 of them and rejoice in having done so. To me it seems like civilization gone mad." Frere had his supporters. He was a selfless man who believed he was acting in the interests of laudable aims, and his entry in the Dictionary of National Biography was stout in his defence, but for many his name had become synonymous with failure and the unacceptable face of empire. Austin's poem, written in 1884, has not a shred of patience with views such as Trollope's, with the new Prime Minister, or with the hostile post-Third Reform Act Houses of Parliament who criticised Frere's actions. Instead, Austin uncompromisingly hails the former governor as a hero whose only mistake is to be born the son of a land no longer heroic. The elegy is suffused with a stern late Victorian imperialist sense that true manliness is decaying in the wake of national feminisation, and that great men no longer have a place in the destiny of the nation. Making no claims to be a great poem, certainly a sincere and stately one, it is nevertheless representative of a historical moment and an anxiety that united a tranche of Tories and ardent pro-imperialists towards the end of the century. The distrust of cultural feminisation here may be compared to fearfulness that decadence was emasculating poetry, poets and readers in the 1890s. What I find particularly interesting about that paragraph is that when they're quoting from Trollope, even Trollope, who disagrees with Frere's approach and definitely thinks that the war is a bad thing, he seems quite critical of that version of imperialism, he still refers to the Zulu population as savages. So yeah, it's that weird idea that, and also the fact that Frere himself was like a strong opponent of slavery, but also willing to just slaughter thousands of people in the interest of his aims. So it's that interesting idea of like, yes, there was progress, but the progress was also coupled with views that we definitely today would not see as at all progressive. This weird idea that you could proceed in one area and still kind of be making backward steps, or still have other areas kind of hanging behind a little bit. So I've just noticed we're 9 minutes into the video and there's not been a poem yet, so I promised you poems. Let's get started. So this is Henry Bartle Edward Frere. Bend down and read the birth, the death, the name, born in the year that Waterloo was won, and died in this, whose days are not yet run, but which, because a year conceived in shame, no noble meed will christen or will claim. And yet this dead man, England, was thy son, and at his grave we ask, what had he done, bred to be famous, to be foiled of fame? Be the reply his epitaph, that he, in years as youth, the unyielding spirit bore he got from thee, but thou hast got no more. And that it is a bane and bar to be a child of thine, now the adventurous sea all vainly beckons to a shrinking shore. Therefore, great soul, within your marble bed, sleep sound, nor hear the useless tears we weep. Why should you wake when England is asleep, or care to live, since England now is dead? Forbidden are the steeps where glory led, no more from furrowed danger of the deep we harvest greatness. To our hearths we creep, count and recount our coin, and nurse our dread. The sophist craft hath grown a prosperous trade, and womanish tribunes hush the manly drum. The very fear of empire strikes us numb, fumbling with pens, who brandished once the blade. Therefore, great soul, sleep sound where you are laid, blessed in being death, when honour now is dumb. Yeah, so the thing that strikes me most is how the rhetoric of this poem really still sounds very familiar, and he starts the poem by calling back to this earlier time and being like, oh, this man was born in the year that Waterloo was won. Like, this man is linked to this kind of heroic, epic, successful past. One thing I meant to say when I was introducing him is that Alfred Austin was born really just at the start of the Victorian era. So by the time he gets made Poet Laureate, he's 60 years old. But he has no memory of anything other than life in the Victorian era. So when he's talking back about this idea of Waterloo being won, he's really reaching back out to something outside of his consciousness. And what it reminds me of is when people kind of hark back to the Second World War, and they kind of hark back to like how amazing the British resistance and rebellion against, the like D-Day and, like all of these kind of heroic and inspirational stories that people draw from the Second World War, where actually potentially they're drawing quite a limited view of that, and maybe not a very analytical view of that historic event. And I feel like the same is happening for Alfred Austin, that he is looking back and saying, oh, Waterloo was this amazing display of British imperial success, but I'm sure a lot of people who were alive at the time of Waterloo would have really preferred it if Britain wasn't a war at that time, and that potentially it's not a war that is entirely composed of noble deeds. So yeah, it's just this idea of harping back towards this kind of like noble, greater past where Britain was like strong and robust and confident, and I think that is definitely something that this country is still very much guilty of, having this kind of like rosy impression of our history that only sees Britain in a positive light, and as a land of heroes that somehow we've all turned into bureaucrats and pen pushers. I was quite amused with that. Fumbling with pens, who brandished once the blade. This idea that somehow people have become less less heroic, less active, less noble. And in a weird way, you can see traces of the kind of pre-Raphaelite feelings in that, this idea that in the past, like the mythical, wonderful world of the past, like the kind of medievalish, chivalric ideas of, people running around with swords and fighting off dragons and whatever. Obviously no specific references to dragons, but yeah. And this kind of resentment that he has of bureaucracy and womanish tribunes, and like just resentment of systems being put in place to make life better and less violent, and somehow this is seen as like weakening the inherent character of the nation. I don't know, it's really weird, but I think it's a really interesting poem to read in terms of having a bit of an insight into how people were thinking and feeling at that time, particularly knowing that this poem and his points of view, it definitely wasn't a national sentiment, but it was enough of a sentiment that this guy was in a very prestigious and powerful position. Powerful as a poet, I suppose. Where people would, his work was being published, his work was being read, his work was being, to a certain extent, admired, and that, I should say, this poem was written before he became poet laureate, so this kind of writing that showed his very strongly held political beliefs, then impacted on his appointment to that position, and so on. I like some of the language that he uses, and it kind of reminds me of kind of maybe like fantasy books, where they quite often draw on this idea of a heroic past, but it's really not in keeping with the real world. And when you put it in the context of the real world, it is in many ways, well, in a lot of ways, quite problematic. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on today's poem, whether you enjoyed it in any way, and what your views are in terms of, I guess, the implications that it has for today and people's changing or not changing political opinions. And yeah, tomorrow, I have a choice for tomorrow. So let me know if you've got any thoughts. There is a poem called Cersei by Julia Augusta Webster, but it's very, very long. So I could read the first section of that, or I could skip Julia Augusta Webster and go on to Algernon Charles Swinburne. Also has really long poems, so I'm going to skip him as well. And then our poem for tomorrow would be by Thomas Hardy. And I love Thomas Hardy, but Julia Augusta Webster would be the last female Victorian poet that we would have a chance to talk about. So kind of torn. So let me know what you would prefer. Okay, take care everyone. Thank you for watching.